my sofa, but I hope it sounds just as good to you guys. So this morning we just want to encourage you in your fasting. I'm going to be talking about Esther and when Esther and all her people fasted. And we just want to keep encouraging you as we're sort of almost in the middle of this fasting. I think, if I'm honest, I've never truly really got fasting until this time round. I've done not that I have fasted a lot, to be fair, but I've done fasting at other churches. Now and again I fasted for other people. But it wasn't until this time we've started fasting, that I've truly think that I have begun to understand it a little bit more. And it's amazed me that I've missed it so much in the Bible. Keith said a couple of weeks ago that fasting goes hand in hand with giving and prayer. How we become Christians and we automatically know that we should give and we automatically know that we should pray. And yet somehow the fasting bit gets shoved to the side. And it isn't until this time that I think I've fully understood the power of fasting, why God encourages us to fast. It's not a command. He doesn't say you should fast every week, you should fast once a month. But he says to the disciples, when you fast. So it's something that he assumes that they will do as part of their Christian life. And I think for me, I've always almost put it aside and didn't really want to get involved with it. But I want to encourage you today to keep going. If you haven't had a go, even just have a go this week. Just 1 meal, 2 meals. We're all doing fasting in our own way. Keith said to do food, but we're all doing it differently, and that is absolutely fine. Some of us can do more than others because we've experienced it before. Some of us are just starting out. Don't feel guilty about what you're doing or what you're not doing. Yeah, fasting is between you and God. We're not checking up who's doing it. It's not about, I did this many meals. It's about between you and God. It's about your relationship with God. And I want everyone just to give it a little go, and you'll be amazed. And I want to show you the story. I want to bring the story of Esther to you this morning. I want to make it alive. I want to show you the power that fasting had on this story. And the God that they served and rescued them is the same God today that we serve and will rescue us. So most of you know the story of Esther. Esther was a girl. She was a Jewish girl, grew up in a Jewish family. She was an orphan. She lost her mum and dad when she was young, and she was brought up by a family member called Mordecai. And she grew up under the reign of King Xerxes in the Persian lands. I think he reigned over about 127 provinces, a lot of land. And she grew up as a Jew. She was a beautiful girl. I think it says that her mum was a beautiful woman. She always inherited her mum's looks. She was very beautiful. And at some point along the way, King Xerxes, he got annoyed with his wife. She didn't listen to him, and he got annoyed, and he cast her aside, and he said, I want to find a new wife. And they sort of put on a major beauty pageant in the lands where he wanted to pick the best looking, the most beautiful girl as his new wife. And they went around and they selected the most beautiful women at that time, one of whom was Esther. And what they did is they kept them in the palace for a few months. They preened them, they pampered them, they had spa days, they had the best makeup, the best food, the best drink, and they were preened for a certain number of months. And then at the end of the day, they were going to be paraded before him, and he was going to pick the best woman. And guess who he picked? Esther. It says that there was something different about Esther. He fell in love with Esther. She was the most beautiful of all the women there. And he picked Esther to be his new queen. And this is where we're going to meet the story at. Esther is his new queen, but she is still a Jew. She still holds on to her roots. She still holds on to the God that she was taught to serve. But Mordecai had always said to her to keep it a secret. Never to tell the king, never to tell any of her servants. She kept it hidden. Now, there's a baddie in the story, and there's a man called Haman. And one day, so Haman, a little bit about him, I think he was some kind of prince. He was almost second in command to King Xerxes. So he was kind of Xerxes' best friend. He was his second in command. He helped him out. And everyone was supposed to bow down to Haman. That was the rule that King Xerxes made, that you had to worship Haman. If he came into the room, you'd have to bow at his feet. You had to give him respect. But one day he noticed that Mordecai didn't do that. He didn't bow down. He didn't show him the same respect that everyone else had. And this made Haman angry. So angry that he didn't just want to get revenge on Mordecai, he wanted to get revenge on every single Jew. Now that's a whole nother sermon of where your bitterness and where your anger can lead to. But he wanted to get rid of every single Jew just because this one man, Mordecai, refused to bow down to him. And so he hatches a plan. He goes to King Xerxes, and this is where we're going to start the story. And I'm going to read you from the Message Bible. And if you want to follow on, it's in Esther chapter 3. When Haman saw for himself that Mordecai didn't bow down and kneel before him, he was outraged. Meanwhile, having learned that Mordecai was a Jew, Haman hasted to waste his fury on just one Jew. He looked for a way to eliminate not just Mordecai, but all Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the first month, the month of Nisan, of the 12th year of Xerxes, that is the lot, was cast under Haman's charge to determine the day and the month. The lot turned up the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Haman then spoke with King Xerxes. There is an odd set of people scattered through the provinces of your kingdom who don't fit in. Their customs and ways are different from those of everybody else. Worse, they disregard the king's laws. They're an affront. The king shouldn't put up with them. If it pleases the king, let orders be given that they be destroyed. I'll pay for it myself. I'll deposit 375 tons of silver in the royal bank to finance the operation. The king slipped his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman. Go ahead, the king said to Haman. It's your money. Do whatever you want with those people. The king's secretaries were brought in on the 13th day of the first month. The orders were written out word for word as Haman had addressed them to the king's satraps, the governors of every province, and the officials of every people. They were written in the script of each province and the language of each people in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the royal signet ring. Bulletins were sent out by couriers to all the king's provinces with orders to massacre, kill and eliminate all the Jews, youngsters and old men, women and babies, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month Adar, and to plunder their goods. Copies of the bulletin were to be posted in each province, publicly available to all peoples to get them ready for that day. At the king's command, the couriers took off. The order was also posted in the palace complex of Susa. The king and Haman sat back and had a drink while the city of Susa reeled from the news. When Mordecai learnt what had been done, he ripped his clothes to shreds and put on sackcloth and ashes. Then he went out in the streets of the city, crying out in loud and bitter cries. He came only as far as the king's gate, for no one dressed in sackcloth was allowed to enter the king's gate. As the king's order was posted in every province, there was a loud lament among the Jews, fasting, weeping, wailing, and most of them stretched out in sackcloth and ashes. Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her. The queen was stunned. She sent fresh clothes to Mordecai so he could take off his sackcloth, but he wouldn't accept them. Esther called for Hathash, one of the royal eunuchs whom the king had assigned to wait on her, and told him to go to Mordecai and get the full story of what was happening. So Hathash went to Mordecai in the town square in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened. He also told him the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to deposit in the royal bank to finance the massacre of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the bulletin that had been posted in Susa to show to Esther when he reported back with instructions to go to the king and intercede and plead with him for her people. Hathash came back and told Esther everything Mordecai had said. Esther talked it over with him and sent him back to Mordecai with this message. Everyone who works for the king here, and even the people out in the provinces, knows that there is a single fate for every man or woman who approaches the king without being invited: death. The one exception is if the king extends his gold scepter, then he or she may live. And it's been 30 days now since I've been invited to come to the king. When Hathash told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai sent her this message. Don't think that just because you live in the king's house, you're the one Jew who will get out of this alive. If you persist in staying silent at a time like this, help and deliverance will arrive from the Jews from someplace else, but you and your family will be wiped out. Who knows? Maybe you were made queen for such a time as this." Esther sent back her answer to Mordecai. "Go and get all the Jews living in Susa together. Fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, either day or night. I and my maids will fast with you. If you will do this, I'll go to the king, even though it's forbidden. If I die, I die." Mordecai left and carried out Esther's instructions. The thing I want to explain a little bit in the beginning is that I kind of noticed this time when I was reading, is that Esther, she didn't panic. And if anyone had a reason to panic, it was the Jews. Their death sentence had literally been set. In a few days' time, they were going to be wiped out. Babies, children, adults, grandparents, 3, possibly 4 generations wiped out in one fell swoop, in one day. So if anyone had any reason to panic, it was them. They were weeping, they were wailing, they put on sackcloth and ashes. Can you imagine what it felt like to know that your death was imminent? And everyone, everything you'd worked for, all of your families, all of your generations gone in one fell swoop. But Esther, she didn't panic. Esther couldn't even meet up with Mordecai to talk about the situation. Such were the laws were so strong about men meeting up with women, and you couldn't be in a room with this person, that Esther couldn't even go and meet Mordecai. They couldn't even have a conversation. They had to send messages to each other. And Mordecai is sending a message to Esther saying, "You've got to do something. You're the only person that can do something about this. You're the only person in the palace. You're the only person with some kind of intimate connection with the king. You have to do something." And Esther replies and she says, "But you know, even though I'm the king's wife, I can't just go and see him. It's not like me and Keith. I can go and see Keith whenever I want or ring him up because I'm his wife." Esther was the king's wife, and yet by royal command, she was not allowed to go and see the king whenever she wanted. The king had to invite her into his presence. The king had to give her an invitation to come in. And so she's saying to Mordecai, "He hasn't invited me for 30 days. I haven't seen the king. What makes you think that I can now just go and walk in and talk to him and ask him to do something?" And Mordecai replies and he says, "You can't be silent." You know, he trusts that God is going to somehow save the Jews, because he says the saving of the Jews might have to come from somewhere else. But if you don't do it, you are going to die, and some of us along with you. And yet Esther, she doesn't panic. You know, most of our response would be, "Oh my goodness, quick, we've got to rush to go and see the king right now, sort it out." And who knows what would have happened if she'd done that. But she doesn't panic. And in her wisdom, what does she say? She says, "Mordecai, no, wait. We're going to wait. Tell everyone, tell all of our Jewish people to fast for 3 days and 3 nights. I will do it with you," she says. "Me and my servants, my maidservants, we will fast too. But put the word out. We're going to fast for 3 days and 3 nights." I was reading about fasting this week, and like Keith was joking about how people say, "Oh, I'm going to die if I fast," or "My body's going to fall apart," or "I'm not going to be able to go to work because I'm going to be so weak." And I was reading about, if you're a healthy adult, the most popular fast is obviously no eating but to carry on drinking. For a healthy adult, you should be able to, your body can physically fast for 40 days until it goes into starvation mode. That's a long time. But if you have no food and you have no drink, 3 days is the maximum, it said, because obviously water is so much more essential to our body. So if you're doing both, 3 days is the maximum. And Esther here, she is facing the worst kind of situation, the annihilation of every single Jew. But in her wisdom, in her godly wisdom, she says, "No, Mordecai, don't panic, wait. And we're going to fast for 3 days, and we're going to fast 3 nights, and we're going to give this to God, and we're going to see what he's going to do." So the first point I want to make today is that the reason we fast is that fasting shifts our perspective.
Yeah.
When you worry about something and when you're focused on one thing, it's like you're looking down on the ground. And when you're looking down, your peripheral vision is really narrow because you can see down, you can see a little bit when you kind of look up, look to the side. But when we focus on one thing, on one issue, one thing that we're burdened with, you know, when we might get a piece of bad news, like someone's got cancer or someone's ill, or I'm going to lose my job, or I'm having this fight with somebody, or I'm not getting on with my spouse. When we focus on the issue at hand, the thing that we're worrying about, and it's like we're looking down, that's all we can see is our issue. Yet when you start looking up, and you start looking up towards God, suddenly your vision is broadened and it's widened, and you can see things clearly. And fasting, I believe, helps you to put things in perspective. For the Jews, that was all they could probably think about. In a few days' time, we're going to be annihilated. That's it. And they're weeping and they're wailing and they're covered in sackcloth and ashes and they're focusing on that thing. But Esther says, no, we're going to fast and we're going to pray. And as we start worshipping and as we start praying and as we start praising God, your focus slowly starts to look up at God. And that's why I believe so often in the Bible it talks again and again about fix your eyes on Jesus. Fix your eyes on the hope that we have. Don't look down. Lift up your soul. Fix your eyes up. Because when you start fixing your eyes on Jesus, things come into perspective. Yes. When you look down, when the Jews were looking down, for them, the king of the land was their king. He set the rule and they had to go along with it. But when they started to fast and when they started to focus on God, it made them remember that actually, no, the King of Kings is their king, not the king of the land was their king, and that the King of Kings, he can control the king of the land, that he has control over everything on this land. And so their perspective started to shift. You know, I think sometimes we skim through characters in the Bible and we don't, like for me, I feel honoured to preach about Esther because she's so strong. And we sometimes skim past these characters. I remember talking, I think the last time I spoke a bit long ago was on Mary, and how we skim past these characters as if, oh yeah, it was fine for Mary, she had Jesus, wow, what an amazing thing. But no, in the reality of the moment, Mary was an outcast. She was seen as a crazy woman. Who goes around saying they've got a supernatural conception? You know, who does that? The reality of what she had to deal with at the time, it's not just this lovely, fluffy fairy story of she had Jesus. She had strength of character. And someone like Esther, when I was reading about her this week, I feel honoured to preach about her because of that strength of character. She didn't panic. Her whole generation was going to be annihilated in a few days' time. And yet her response was, no, Mordecai, wait, we're going to fast. We're going to pray. We're going to seek God. Esther herself said, the king hasn't invited me in for 30 days. You know, even Esther personally, she started off perhaps from a place of discouragement. The king got rid of his first wife, easy as pie. He could do what he wanted. He just got rid of her just because, I can't remember the situation. He spoke to her and she refused to answer or something like that. And the king hasn't invited Esther into his chamber for 30 days. Imagine what's going on in her head. Is the king starting to change his mind about me? Is he not interested in me anymore? Is there somebody else out there? Esther herself even started off from a place of discouragement because the king was not showing any interest in her. And that she could have been worrying, is it going to happen to me? Is he going to cast me aside like his first wife? But no. She puts aside her discouragement and her worry. And I just wanted to say that some people in their life, they get stuck at this point and they never get out of it. You know, Esther could have been stuck here in her worry about maybe you then start to make up stories. The king's not interested in me. He's not inviting me to see him. Is there someone else on the side? And she might have started to make up stories. And some people get stuck in life. Like for me, one thing that brings me the most joy is seeing people walk in freedom. because I know what it's like not to be in freedom, like to be enslaved to something and to be enslaved in your mind. And for me, the reason Jesus died, like Johnny was saying this morning, is to bring freedom. Like as Christians, we're not supposed to live in this life where it's a hardship and it's a toil and we struggle with our mind and we struggle with issues. But that is why Jesus came, is to bring freedom from everything. And some people get stuck where Esther was, in this position of constantly worrying and constantly fearing. But Esther, she chose not to get stuck there. She chose to put her trust in God, and she chose in her wisdom to lead her people and said, no, wait. The king has set this law. He signed it with a signet ring, so be it. But I don't serve that king. I don't serve that king of the land. I serve the King of Kings, and he can rescue us. And so we're going to fast, and we're going to pray, and we're going to worship God, because he is the one that can do something about it. No one else could do anything about it. So this morning, we're going to do a little bit. Do you want to do it?
No, carry on.
Okay. We're going to do some prayer after. Okay, so first point, fasting shifts your perspective. So this week when you're fasting, don't think that your fasting is in vain. You know, I know we're doing like a community fast, which like it really chuffs me to bits that everyone wants to join in. Like I think it's so amazing that everyone is having a go and everyone's joining in with everyone else. And there's a certain strength from that, I think, that we're all doing it together. But also don't forget that it's also about changing you personally, and that you can bring things to God in your life. So for me personally, the only reason I'm standing here is because we're fasting, basically. Like I have a lot of fears in my life, one of them being this, and yet this is my dream. This is what I have dreamt about for ages. I've preached in my head, I've preached in the house. So this is my desire, is to teach people. But I often let fear grip me. And Keith has often asked me to speak, and I don't, because I fear. But at the beginning of this fast, I said to God, this is actually it now. Because I'm 36. I'm nearly halfway through my life and I'm still afraid. But this is what fasting is all about. It's hitting your fears front on. It's about bringing to God the things that you are struggling with and that you want a breakthrough in. And so last week when I was praying, I was saying, God, no, I fear this and I fear this and I fear this. But this time round, it's going to be the end. And this is what fasting does. It shifts your perspective. I need to shift my perspective from thinking, everyone's looking at me, what am I going to say? What if I forget what to say? What if I don't know what to say? It doesn't matter. If I feel God's called me to do this, then I need to shift my perspective and say, it doesn't matter if I feel weak. My spirit is excited, but my body is shaking. But it doesn't matter, because God has called me to do this. And if I focus on God, He's the only one that can help me to do it. And so this week, as you are fasting, think about things in your life that you want to shift. And shift your perspective and know that with God, you can do anything. And you can get rid of anything. And things in your family, they can be cut off. And they don't have to continue. And things that you're struggling with, whatever things they might be, can be cut off. And shift your perspective this week. So firstly, fasting helps to shift your perspective. Secondly, fasting disturbs reality. Fasting disturbs reality. After the 3 days of prayer and fasting, it says in chapter 6, that night that King Xerxes couldn't sleep.
No.
King Xerxes couldn't sleep. The fasting of the Jews disturbed his reality.
Yeah.
He normally slept. He was a king of so many provinces. He had whatever he wanted. He had maids, he had servants, he had food, he had numerous women. He had everything you could possibly want. He probably slept soundly like a baby every night. But this night, he couldn't sleep because the fasting of the Jews disturbed his reality.
Wow.
And I want to say to you this morning that your fasting, it matters and it counts.
Yeah.
And it disturbs people's realities.
Yeah.
Not just yours, but also people around you.
Yeah.
It disturbs their reality. Keith mentioned to me, it's not specifically about fasting, but something I'd never noticed about Pilate's wife when Jesus was on trial about to be crucified, and Pilate's wife gives him a message in the middle of the day and says, you need to be careful, you need to release this man because I'm being disturbed in my dreams.
Yeah, disturbed.
And I've never really noticed that before, but in your fasting, God will disturb people.
Yeah.
And not just in the physical, but also in the dream world.
Yeah.
In dreams and visions, God will disturb people and he will move people. You know, King Xerxes, he was the only one that could change the law. He signed the law that said all the Jews were going to be wiped out. So he was the only one that could change it. And Esther and the Jews knew that. But God could change King Xerxes. Maybe they couldn't change the law, but God can help to change the law. And Keith mentioned he wanted kind of to look at, and we're going to pray for it later, about the importance of praying for our leaders and people in authority over us. Not just leaders, like as in Boris Johnson or Trump or whoever, but anyone that has authority over us, our bosses at work, you know, a massive thing that I think, school teachers and head teachers, like who are over our children. But our fasting and our prayer for them can disturb their reality, can disturb them to do something. We physically might not be able to go and say something to them. We might not be a governor of the school body, or we might not be in parliament. But our prayer and our fasting can reach through and disturb their reality.
That's good.
And we can't necessarily change the law. We can't change the law of the land. We can't, you know, we see people advocating for abortion and all these kinds of things, but our prayer and fasting can disturb their reality and can make things different. And King Xerxes, he couldn't sleep. His reality was disturbed.
Amen.
So one, fasting shifts your perspective. Fasting disturbs reality. God to move. Ultimately, fasting allows God to move. It doesn't mean that God doesn't move normally. Of course, he still moves when you pray, or he still moves in your life. But there's something about fasting. There's a reason why Jesus gave us fasting. He doesn't just give us things for no reason. He gives us tools. He gives us tools that allow us to get closer to him. He gives us tools that allow our life to be enhanced, that allow us to get closer to him. And there's a reason why he gave us fasting. And fasting allows God to move in more of a supernatural way, maybe than even before. And this blows my mind, this does. That night, King Xerxes couldn't sleep. He ordered the record book, the day-by-day journal of events, to be brought and read to him. They came across a story there about the time that Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh, the two royal eunuchs who guarded the entrance, and who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. The king asked, "What great honour was given to Mordecai for this?" "Nothing," replied the king's servants who were in attendance. "Nothing has been done for him." So the king, he couldn't sleep. He doesn't put on nice, soft, classical music or something to kind of lull him to sleep. He decides to read his day-by-day diary, which was a day-by-day written account of everything that had happened in his reign. So I thought, okay, how long has he reigned for? He's reigned for 12 years. That comes to 4,380 days of an account, if he was keeping a record of a day-to-day account. And of those 4,380 days, they happened to read a passage about, I don't know quite exactly how far before, when Mordecai foiled a plot. Two men tried to assassinate King Xerxes. And he foiled the plot, and the men, I presume they were killed, and the king was rescued. That was not a coincidence. No. Out of those 4,380 days, God shone a light on that particular day or time, I don't know how long they read to him during the night, of that particular passage, which highlighted what Mordecai had done for the king all that time ago. God did not forget Mordecai. He wasn't shown any recognition at that time. He was almost just brushed aside. "Thank you, Mordecai, well done," end of. Yet the king's reality was disturbed. And God shone a light on that particular passage. Out of all those number of days, the big journals that he would have had, he happened to read that passage. That is not a coincidence.
No.
That is God starting to move. That was the beginning of God starting to move and put the pieces of the puzzle together for the fact that he was going to save the Jews.
Amen.
Fasting allows God to move. And fasting will highlight things to you. Yvonne mentioned last week about how sometimes in fasting, God will highlight things like who you need to forgive. Things that you've brushed over and you've thought, I don't really like that person, but you just kind of moved on. But sometimes fasting highlights things in your life that you need to change, things you've forgotten about, things where you've thought it's not really an issue, but it's niggled away at you for years and years. And God will highlight it and say, actually, you know what? You need to sort this out. And here, God shone that light on that passage so that the king could hear that passage about Mordecai. And he wondered why Mordecai had never been honoured and why he'd never been respected. And so he wanted to do something about it. And that was the beginning of God moving. All because Esther had the wisdom to slow the pace down, to slow the panic down, and say, no, wait, we're going to fast for 3 days and for 3 nights. And we're going to shift our perspective. We're not going to focus on the fact that in a few days' time we're going to be wiped out, but we're going to focus on God and the fact that my God can do anything, and that my God, he can change the laws of the land, and that my God, he can change what the king thinks, and my God, he can get through to the king, he can disturb the king in his sleep, he can hear a passage about Mordecai, something that happened years ago, and want to reward him and want to recognize him. And that was the beginning of God rescuing the Jews. And because of their prayer and fasting, 3 days later, Esther, dressed in her royal robes, took up a position in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's throne room. The king was on his throne facing the entrance. When he noticed Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased to see her. The king extended the gold scepter in his hand. Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. The king asked, "What is your desire, Queen Esther? What do you want? Ask, and it's yours, even if it's half my kingdom." And so the story finishes. You can carry on reading it. That Esther was emboldened by her fast. She was emboldened because she decided to fix her eyes on God and not the problem and not the situation. And she was emboldened, and God put favour onto her so that when the king noticed her in the corner of the room, he extended his golden scepter and he initiated the conversation and said, "Esther, what would you like?" And she went on to say that she wanted a banquet, and then obviously you all know the end of the story, in that Haman was the one that was hung in the end instead of Mordecai, and the roles were reversed, and God completely reversed that law into the end that they were allowed to worship their God because of the wisdom of Esther and because of the fasting. So fasting, it shifts your perspective. It shifts your perspective from focusing on the situation and focusing on God. Fasting disturbs reality. Don't think that anything is impossible for God. Don't think that any person is impossible for God to get through to, because he'll get through to them. Whether they're awake or whether they're asleep, he will get through to them. He will disturb their dreams if he needs to. He will disturb their reality. Fasting moves reality, and fasting allows God to move. There's something special that happens in fasting, and I think for the first time this time round I've realised how important fasting is. Because when I fasted this week, I don't know about anyone else, I felt that I could do anything. Which sounds crazy because you think, I'm going to be weak, I'm going to be tired. But it's the opposite. God gives you a supernatural strength that when you fast, that he is there, that he is near to you, and that he is going to move. And for the next few days, as you carry on fasting, we've got the rest of this week and a little bit of next week, have a go. Keep going. Think about the things that need to be moved. We were talking in the prayer room about Anna's family and things that need to be shifted and in people's generations. Start thinking about those things that you want shifted in your life. We're not just dieting, we're not just doing it because Keith told us to do it, we're doing it personally as well for God to move in your lives. And me and Keith, we want to see people walking in this church in freedom. Not just walking in and out on a Sunday exactly the same, not in 5 years being the same. We want to see people step into God. We want to see people moving in freedom, and that's what Jesus came to do. That's what Johnny was talking about this morning. The blood of Jesus, it came. What a waste if we don't start living in that freedom, or if we don't expect God to be able to give us that freedom. And Keith's going to come up and we're going to pray on some of these points.